In the dying embers of the Second World War, the world stood blinded by its own victory. Nations buried evidence faster than they rebuilt cities, and the documents that survived were locked away under layers of new governments and shifting alliances. But some files refused to stay buried, from the frozen silence of the Arctic to the scorched fields of Eastern Europe. A trail of sealed orders, missing personnel, and unmarked convoys points to a version of history the victors never intended to tell. What began as isolated anomalies now forms a single, chilling narrative, a record of secret operations, vanished technologies, and the lingering ghosts of empires that refused to die. Chapter 1. Operation Winterglass, the Arctic Signal. In February 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled under Allied bombardment, a convoy of German vessels slipped quietly out of Narvik under the cover of an Arctic storm. Designated as Convoy Eiskristall, or Convoy Ice Crystal, it consisted of 3 Type Nweintsee submarines, 2 refitted trawlers, and a weather ship listed under civilian registry. Intelligence records show the fleet's manifest listed meteorological equipment and frozen biological samples, but subsequent decrypts from Bletchley Park revealed a different term entirely: Project Alder. The transmissions stopped abruptly on March 2, 1944, near 79° latitude, where the Barents Sea begins to solidify into drifting sheets of ice. For years, Allied command assumed the ships had been lost to storms or Soviet mines. But in 1952, when a US Navy listening post at Tromsø detected faint, rhythmic Morse bursts repeating the word Alder, the story resurfaced. The signal was weak, distorted by magnetic interference, but unmistakably German in origin. Naval intelligence classified the intercept as Operation Winterglass, and by July of that year, a joint Anglo-Norwegian expedition was underway to locate the source. The expedition's official cover was simple: scientific research into polar acoustics and ice formation. Its lead vessel, HMS Endurance, carried equipment provided by the Royal Navy's Admiralty Signal Establishment, but the team's manifest concealed another layer. Among the cargo were Geiger counters, long-range sonar buoys, and sealed crates marked US Navy Strategic Materials Division. The operation was overseen by Commander Arthur Hallberg, a Norwegian-born British officer who had served in the Royal Navy's Arctic convoys. Declassified records from his personal log, recovered decades later, describe the mission's tone as uneasy from the first hour. On August 14, 1952, the Endurance recorded a sonar contact roughly 90 meters below the ice shelf, a shape too symmetrical to be natural. Divers were deployed despite extreme conditions. What they found would later vanish from all official transcripts. In a 1971 memorandum, Hallberg's first officer, Lieutenant Peter Kavanagh, wrote privately to the Admiralty's historical branch describing a metallic fuselage fragment bearing markings consistent with Reich Luftwaffe standards, yet fabricated from alloys unknown to post-war metallurgy. The sample was photographed, catalogued, and placed aboard the support ship Svalbard for transfer to Britain. Neither the object nor the ship ever arrived. 2 days after the find, the Endurance reported a sudden geomagnetic storm disrupting radio communication. The crew recorded compass deviations of up to 40 degrees and an auroral display pulsing unnaturally. Within hours, the Morse signal ceased. Officially, the cause was listed as atmospheric interference. Unofficially, the Royal Navy sealed all files related to Winterglass under the NATO Security Accords Section 12, used only for material deemed of exceptional scientific or geopolitical sensitivity. In the early 1960s, during oil exploration near Svalbard, a drilling rig struck metal debris beneath permafrost. The fragments bore serial engravings beginning with Reichsforschung 1944 AL. Engineers reported faint residual magnetism, and the site was cordoned off by military authorities within hours. Witnesses claimed US Air Force personnel arrived unannounced the next day. Within a week, all equipment and drilling records were confiscated. The project was reclassified as part of Strategic Polar Intelligence Directive 9B, a file still redacted in its entirety. Historians later speculated that Project Alder might have involved early research into compact fission cells or magnetic propulsion systems, an extension of the Sonnengeflecht experiments documented at Peenemünde. However, no surviving documents connect the Arctic convoy to known Nazi research programs. What little evidence exists Photographs, sonar charts, and fragments of Hallberg's journals suggest that something was transported north, possibly for burial under the ice. One declassified CIA memorandum dated December 1967, titled Foreign Material Recovery, Arctic Source and References, a joint US-UK retrieval near 78 de Grain. The note includes a single cryptic line, power readings consistent with a decaying isotopic lattice, material origin undetermined. A follow-up report was scheduled for March 1968 but never filed. All subsequent archival requests for Winterglass or Alder return the same response. No record found. When Hallberg retired in 1969, he withdrew to a remote village in Nordland. In 1974, a Norwegian journalist named Erik Lund visited him while researching Cold War intelligence operations. Lund's notes describe Hallberg as haunted, deliberate, yet unwilling to contradict official accounts. Only after several hours of silence did Hallberg reveal a single photograph, a blurred image showing an object resembling a torpedo nose cone etched with a double eagle insignia. The commander claimed it was one of 5 recovered, each supposedly housing energy cores that emitted a low hum even when disconnected from any power source. Lund's article was never published. Weeks later, his apartment in Oslo was ransacked, his typewriter destroyed, and his notes stolen. Police ruled it a burglary. The photograph resurfaced 20 years later in an estate sale among unclaimed wartime memorabilia, bearing a British War Office inventory tag dated September 1952. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, fragments of Cold War intelligence hinted at similar Arctic retrieval missions conducted by both sides. A 1991 Russian Ministry of Defense memo, declassified after the fall of the USSR, mentions residual radiation hotspots within former German transit zones north of Franz Josef Land. Soviet engineers attempted to locate the sites, but found only rusted hull remnants and faint radiation traces consistent with decayed uranium-235. To this day, the Arctic ice hides more than wreckage. In 2004, Norwegian satellite imaging detected a long, linear anomaly beneath the eastern edge of the Barents ice shelf, roughly 87 meters long, metallic in density, and aligned due east. Attempts to obtain permission for excavation were denied on grounds of environmental protection. Unconfirmed leaks from the Norwegian Geotechnical Institute suggest the shape bears resemblance to early submarine hulls, but the magnetic field distortion remains unexplained. Operation Winterglass was never officially closed. Its final entry, dated November 3, 1952, reads simply, "Source signal terminated. Retrieval inconclusive. Site reclassified per directive of higher authority." Every officer involved either resigned or was reassigned within 6 months. Commander Hallberg's death certificate, filed in 1977, listed cause of death as cardiac failure. Yet local records show his grave remains unmarked, the burial arranged by an undisclosed foreign agency. And still, the transmissions echo faintly through classified naval archives, recordings captured by Cold War sonar arrays that continue to register rhythmic bursts at 12-second intervals. Analysts describe them as nothing more than ice fracturing under stress, but the pattern remains unchanged since 1945, pulsing through the Arctic silence like the heartbeat of something that refuses to die. Chapter 2. The Odessa. Transmissions. Escape through silence. In the spring of 1948, the world was still adjusting to the illusion of peace. Europe's rubble had begun to harden into new borders, and behind every embassy desk and customs counter, ghosts moved quietly in forged uniforms and neutral passports. Among them was the shadow network, known as Odessa, the Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, the alleged underground route for SS officers escaping Allied tribunals. While its existence has been debated for decades, recently unsealed intercepts from the US Army Security Agency suggest a darker layer beneath the myth, one that connected war criminals not just to escape lines, but to ongoing technological exchange. That layer carried a name never mentioned in open records: Channel Weiss. The first trace appeared on June 9, 1948, when a signal intelligence unit stationed near Linz intercepted a shortwave burst coded in modified Wehrmacht cipher, transmitting on a Soviet frequency band. The encryption did not match any known post-war traffic. The message consisted of 47 characters, among them the recurring triad WSS, the same abbreviation once used for Waffen-SS operational codes. Analysts initially dismissed it as residual interference, yet 3 days later another burst followed, identical in structure, but this time ending with a single Latin phrase: Silenti opus perpetuat. Silence preserves the work. At the time, Western intelligence agencies were drowning in conflicting missions. MI6 ran Baris, Operation Selection Board, a covert recruitment program aimed at harnessing ex-Nazi scientists before the Soviets could reach them. The Americans had already launched Operation Paperclip under the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. But what neither side publicly acknowledged was the enormous number of untraceable personnel who had simply disappeared from POW registers. Over 2,000 names listed in the Wehrmacht's final rosters, including men linked to rocket propulsion, bioweapons, and advanced metallurgy, were never accounted for. When the Linz bursts began, it was assumed the Soviets were coordinating post-war asset extractions. Then came the discovery of coordinates buried within the signal frequencies themselves. Coordinates leading not east, but south. Decoded field reports later tied the transmissions to locations in northern Italy, primarily around Trieste and Bolzano. Those regions, controlled by Allied military government at the time, were hotbeds of black market migration routes. Smugglers, priests, and former intelligence officers all competed in the quiet exodus of defeated men. But the Channel-Weiss traffic did not correspond to human smuggling. It appeared to track cargo. Freight manifests intercepted at Genoa's docks referenced crates marked agricultural equipment, destination Buenos Aires. Customs photographs, since declassified, reveal faint Heinkel factory stamps on the container wood. In September 1948, the CIA's Vienna station issued a report labeled Directive Weiss No. 7. It described coordinated efforts by former Luftwaffe engineers to establish civilian research centers in South America under false identities. Among the documents was a hand-sketched schematic titled Heinkel R Entwicklungsreihe 3 Pro, a design suspiciously similar to the tail assembly of early jet prototypes never completed in wartime Germany. The report was buried after a single review by the Joint Chiefs Scientific Division. A margin note scrawled in pencil reads, "Paperclip duplication risk, terminate reference." As the Cold War intensified, communications monitoring expanded. From December 1948 through February 1949, the same pattern of coded bursts continued. Short, precise, always ending in silence. 2 US Army listening stations near Trieste were later destroyed in what official records call power overload incidents. The timing is suspicious, both within 48 hours of successfully decrypting messages that referenced Colibri transit. Stage 4. Surviving fragments of those decrypts mention a shipment involving core cylinders, stabilizer housings, and sealed catalysts. The technical language matches components of experimental rocket fuel cells developed at the Heinkel works during late 1944, when Italian police raided an abandoned airfield near Udine in March 1949. They discovered parts of a disassembled jet fuselage buried beneath crates of civilian radios. The parts bore serials beginning with HR-47 WWII, aligning with Heinkel's post-war engineering records that officially did not exist. American investigators confiscated the materials under classified custody. Days later, the local magistrate handling the case died in a car accident on his way to deliver testimony to the Allied Control Council. The CIA's internal history of Odessa, compiled in 1952 but declassified only in part, makes one cryptic reference to radio contact maintained via Weiss until termination order by Central Authority, 21st June 1949. After that date, no further transmissions were logged. However, Argentine customs records show that on June 25, 1949, a ship named Sierra Norita arrived at Mar del Plata, carrying unidentified German cargo labeled industrial turbines. Witnesses later claimed to have seen military crates unloaded under guard, driven inland toward Neuquén province, home to numerous German enclaves established after the war. For decades, Channel Weiss was dismissed as another post-war rumor, a ghost story of vanished war criminals. But in 1998, a retired German radio operator named Friedrich Rössler surfaced in Hamburg with a collection of wax cylinder recordings. The recordings captured faint bursts of coded tones identical to those logged by the Linz interceptors in 1948. Rössler claimed to have worked for an organization called Technische Hilfsstelle Weiss, a front company operating under the British Zone's Reconstruction Bureau. He stated that the transmissions were sent under supervision of American officers, but decoded elsewhere. Within weeks of his disclosure, Rössler was found dead in his apartment. His death was ruled asphyxiation caused by faulty gas heating. The cylinders vanished from police evidence storage 3 days later. Researchers have since attempted to reconstruct the purpose of Channel Weiss from scattered references across intelligence archives. Some suggest it functioned as an encrypted communication line between Western intelligence agencies and former Nazi specialists relocated under controlled conditions, a plausible extension of paperclip operations. Others argue it was a rogue network, funded through Vatican intermediaries and Argentine banking channels, sustaining secret technological research long after the Reich's fall. Whatever the truth, every trace of Weiss converges on one phrase repeated throughout recovered intercepts: Stille schützt das Werk. Silence protects the work. An anonymous memorandum discovered in the Bundesarchiv in 2009 contains an even more chilling detail. It references a meeting held at the US consulate in Zurich on April 2, 1949, attended by representatives from American, British, and Swiss intelligence. The topic, according to the note, was containment of unauthorized transmissions compromising relocation operations. At the bottom of the page, a single annotation is scrawled in red pencil. Weiss neutralized, assets secured. Project continues under new designation, South Cross. The memo bears no signature. The last surviving echo of Channel Weiss occurred on January 3, 1950, when a South American radio amateur operating near Bariloche recorded a faint Morse pattern identical to the Linz bursts, same sequence, same closing triad. The operator, an engineer named Raul Mendoza, turned the recording over to local authorities, who dismissed it as interference from naval frequencies. 2 weeks later, Mendoza vanished while traveling to Buenos Aires. His recording was never returned. Today, the Odessa transmissions remain a phantom chapter of post-war intelligence history. Every attempt to map its routes leads to missing ships, erased personnel files, and warehouses that officially never existed. Still, beneath the bureaucratic dust and Cold War paranoia, the pattern persists. Southward migration, coded silence, and technology that reappeared decades later in unexpected places. A fragment of a 1957 US Air Force patent describes a fuel compression chamber eerily similar to the Heinkel R diagrams found in the Weiss archives. Whether by design or coincidence, the network that began as an escape line may have become something else entirely. A covert continuum of minds and machines bound not by allegiance, but by secrecy. And somewhere, deep in those unmarked transmissions that crossed the Alps and the Atlantic, the last heartbeat of the Third Reich pulsed quietly into the static, waiting for someone to listen. Chapter 3. Project Larkspur, The Forgotten Division. Berlin. Spring of 1946. The city was an open wound, rubble stacked higher than the remaining walls, smoke curling from basements that still hid families, soldiers, and secrets. The occupying powers each carved their zones, each with their own agenda. For most Allied officers, the war had ended. For the few assigned to Project Larkspur, it had only changed its form. The project's stated goal was psychological research into adversary methodology. Unofficially, it sought something far darker: to weaponize the human mind by studying the patterns of obedience and fear that had sustained the Reich. Project Larkspur began under the authority of the US Army's Psychological Warfare Division, headquartered in Frankfurt. It was conceived by Colonel Nathaniel Ross, a clinical psychologist who had served with OSS Detachment 204, a field unit responsible for interrogating captured Gestapo personnel. According to Ross's surviving correspondence, the operation was established in January 1946 as Experimental Detachment 204B, stationed in a requisitioned hospital near Tempelhof. Its purpose was to develop interrogation-resistant conditioning through controlled sensory alternation. But the first subjects weren't Soviet prisoners. They were former Gestapo analysts offered clemency in exchange for cooperation. Declassified fragments from the detachment's internal memoranda, preserved in the US National Archives under misfiled reference MED PSY 46, describe early experiments involving sound isolation, repetitive signal exposure, and induced insomnia. Room 3C of the Tempelhof facility was equipped with a single narrow bed, concrete walls lined with copper mesh, and a ceiling-mounted metronome connected to an audio oscillator. Former technicians recall the steady clicking that echoed through the hallways for days without interruption. The subjects were required to recite intercepted Soviet ciphers while exposed to fluctuating light frequencies, a crude attempt to measure the effect of stress and rhythm on memory recall. By April 1947, Larkspur's staff had grown to 42 personnel, including linguists, psychiatrists, and 2 chemical engineers transferred from Fort Detrick. That same month, a memo labeled LSP 4713 Main ordered the introduction of pharmacological facilitators. The drugs referenced are believed to include scopolamine and early LSD derivatives, later forming the foundation for MK Ultra trials in the 1950s. Witnesses describe subjects restrained for up to 72 hours under constant illumination, monitored through one-way glass by American officers and their German counterparts. Many of the German participants were men whose SS records had been sealed under denazification waivers. Their new badges bore only numbers. The project's results were initially encouraging. Reports to the war, department claimed measurable compliance conditioning and reduction of cognitive resistance, but a classified medical logbook recovered from the hospital's basement in 1991 tells a different story. The entries, written in a mixture of English and German, detail severe autonomic failure, acute psychosis, and irreversible dissociation among test subjects. Out of 31 individuals processed during the first year, 17 died, 9 were institutionalized, and 5 were transferred to an unspecified facility. Codenamed Camp Victor Colonel, Ross submitted his final progress report on August 8, 1948. It concluded that further application should be restricted to field-limited scenarios under compartmentalized authority. Within weeks, Ross disappeared from Army rolls. His personnel file lists him as reassigned to Fort Bragg, but no records of his arrival exist. His name appears once more on the passenger manifest of a civilian aircraft that crashed in the Swiss Alps that October. The flight's destination was Geneva, not Bragg. In 1950, a Senate subcommittee on human experimentation subpoenaed records relating to US psychological research in occupied Europe. Every file associated with Project Larkspur had been removed from the archives and replaced with blank pages stamped "Cancelled, Directive 672C. When investigators questioned the War Department, they were told the project had been a proposal that never advanced beyond planning. Yet by then, dozens of veterans in the Berlin occupation zone had reported strange orders, sealed couriers, and the sudden disappearance of German interpreters attached to military hospitals. A few scattered accounts survived. In 1953, a former translator named Erika Schneider contacted journalist Harold Baird with claims that she had witnessed experiments conducted on men without uniforms or identities. Baird recorded their conversation, portions of which surfaced decades later in the private papers of author William Manchester. Schneider described hearing a heartbeat behind the walls of the Tempelhof Hospital, synchronized with the ticking of a metronome. She said she saw charts labeled Delta Pattern and Reversal Stage, pinned beside American flags and the insignia of the Army Medical Corps. Before she could provide supporting evidence, Schneider vanished from her apartment in Hamburg. The local police report simply reads, "No sign of forced entry." The name Larkspur resurfaced once more during the Church Committee hearings of 1975, when a partially declassified CIA budget appendix listed PSYOPs Historical Continuity, LSP, under the Directorate of Science and Technology. When questioned, officials stated that LSP referred to archival cross-referencing of psychological warfare materials. However, several lines of expenditure reference payments to European medical consultants and translation of recovered German data. The files were sealed again under national security grounds. In 1982, construction workers renovating an old administration wing near Tempelhof uncovered a sealed steel door hidden behind layers of plaster. Inside was a small chamber filled with rusted equipment and reels of magnetic wire. The labeling on the reels bore English and German markings. LSP-12, subject response 47A. Analysts who later examined surviving fragments described distorted human speech layered with rhythmic clicking and low-frequency hums. Experts from the Bundeskriminalamt concluded that the recordings were consistent with early psychometric patterning experiments. One investigator described the sound as almost mechanical, breathing. Forensic studies on the room's remains revealed high concentrations of mercury and trace elements associated with neurological experiments. The chamber was demolished within weeks, and the recovered materials were transferred to the U.S. Army's Medical Research Archives in Maryland. None of the reels have been publicly released. Some historians argue that Project Larkspur represented the first formal attempt at cognitive warfare, using behavioral engineering to predict or manipulate enemy decision-making. Others see it as the unacknowledged precursor to MK Ultra and Artichoke. Yet fragments of German correspondence found in Soviet archives complicate the narrative. A report from the Stasi's Scientific Directorate dated 1961 notes that the Americans conducted illegal behaviorist trials in Berlin between 1946 and 1948, utilizing ex-Gestapo personnel. A second annotation, in Russian handwriting, reads simply, "We recovered one." Whether that meant a subject or a scientist remains unknown. In 2005, a private collector in Prague auctioned a film reel labeled Tempelhof 204B. The footage, silent and grainy, depicts uniformed men saluting an insignia blending an American eagle with an SS rune, identical to the image described in the 1971 Senate inquiry footnotes. The reel was purchased anonymously for $41,000. 2 weeks later, the auction house burned down in what investigators called an electrical fire. Every reference to Project Larkspur carries the same undertone of erasure. Names redacted, coordinates blacked out, dates misaligned by months. It is as though the project existed only in the margins of larger operations, feeding into the Cold War's machinery of psychological control. Even today, retired intelligence officers refuse to discuss it. The few who acknowledge its existence refer to it as the Forgotten Division, a place where minds were broken to find the limits of loyalty and where silence became a form of command. What remains of Larkspur are whispers, of a metronome that ticked endlessly beneath the rubble of Berlin, marking the rhythm between memory and obedience, and a voice repeating numbers in the dark long after the war had ended. Chapter 4. The Tunguska Blueprint, Stalin's Secret Retrieval. On a grey morning in June 1947, the Soviet Union's Council of Ministers convened under highest secrecy at the Kremlin. Among the agenda items, buried between industrial reconstruction reports and agricultural quotas, was a single page marked Volkov, Strogo Sekretno. Volkov, top secret. It referred not to a person, but to an operation. Its objective, to locate and retrieve the remnants of a pre-war anomaly buried deep in the Siberian wilderness. Stalin had revived an old investigation that had haunted Russian science since 1908. The Tunguska explosion. For decades, official accounts claimed the Tunguska event was the result of a meteor airburst, but the NKVD archives tell a more unsettling story. In 1927, a geologist named Leonid Kulik led the first Soviet expedition to the site. His team reported melted rock formations, flattened trees, and small spheres of fused metal, findings that contradicted the standard meteor theory. When Kulik's materials were transferred to Moscow, several samples were immediately classified by the military. One document from 1933, stamped with the seal of the People's Commissariat for Defense, described non-terrestrial isotopic structures exhibiting radio emission inconsistent with known elements. Kulik's findings vanished, and his follow-up expedition was cancelled under the pretext of resource shortages. 2 decades later, with the Cold War crystallizing, Stalin ordered the formation of a scientific task force under the Ministry of State Security. The directive, Operation Volkov, assembled physicists from the Kurchatov Institute, engineers from the Dnipropetrovsk Artillery Works, and a platoon of NKVD troops, led by Colonel Mikhail Volkov. Their mission, to locate the impact epicenter and recover whatever Kulik had missed. Internal memoranda declassified in the 1990s describe the team's departure from Irkutsk in December 1947, traveling north through Yakut territory under brutal conditions. Their cover story claimed they were testing magnetic mapping equipment. When they arrived in the Tunguska Basin, they found an area still eerily lifeless despite 40 years of regrowth. Volkov's field journal, preserved in fragments, recorded concentric burn rings and metallic lattice fragments embedded in permafrost. Geiger readings spiked at irregular intervals, then dropped abruptly, as if the radiation was being absorbed by something beneath the soil. The soldiers were ordered to dig at the site, where compasses failed to align. By the 5th day, they struck metal. The object unearthed was described as a curved plate with honeycomb patterning, 4.6 meters in width. When struck with tools, it emitted a resonant tone that persisted for several seconds. A technical sketch included in the report labeled it Segment B3. Unknown alloy, non-ferrous. Magnetic field inverse polar. It was loaded onto sleds and transported to Krasnoyarsk, and from there, flown under cover of darkness to Artemis 16, the heart of the Soviet atomic program. By early 1948, Stalin received an interim report from physicist Alexander Leontiev stating that the material demonstrated extraordinary energy dispersion capacity, potentially applicable to shielding or propulsion. Leontiev requested permission to conduct full-scale experiments under laboratory conditions. Stalin approved, establishing a new research cell called Project Seraphim, placed under direct NKVD oversight. Within months, the first Seraphim experiment began at a secure site in Semipalatinsk. Scientists attempted to replicate the Tunguska lattice using conventional metallurgy, but the sample defied analysis. Its structure reorganized under heat, maintaining constant temperature despite direct plasma exposure. When a particle accelerator test was attempted in July 1949, the chamber walls reportedly vibrated until the test was aborted. Witnesses claimed they could hear a low hum, like a pulse, even after power was cut. The sample was sealed in a lead container and labeled Specimen 0. Soviet records from 1950 refer to thermal discharges detected at the Seraphim site during a series of nighttime tests. American intelligence noticed the anomalies too. Declassified CIA reconnaissance cables under FHM. Operation Aureole. Reference: Sustained heat blooms in Kazakh sector 47 degree on. Non-nuclear signature. U-2 overflights detected the same glow but no fallout residue. In Washington, analysts suspected the Soviets had developed an energy-based propulsion system. However, no matching weapons program was ever identified. By autumn 1950, reports from within the Seraphim complex began describing malfunctions and personnel illness. Several engineers reported visual distortions and loss of equilibrium after handling Specimen 0. When the lead containment failed during a routine transfer, the material emitted a flash described as silent lightning. 3 researchers collapsed, and one later died from unexplained neural hemorrhaging. NKVD officials sealed the laboratory and ordered immediate termination of the project. A final memorandum from Colonel Volkov, dated April 1951, states, "Replication unsuccessful. Original source irretrievable. Recommend containment of data and physical evidence. Further exposure not authorized." Weeks later, a catastrophic explosion leveled Building 7 at the Seraphim site. Officially, the cause was listed as a gas detonation. Unofficially, seismic sensors recorded no typical shockwave signature. The destruction pattern matched an inward collapse rather than an outward blast. In the aftermath, all surviving records of Operation Volkov and Project Seraphim were classified under the Soviet Union's most restricted category. Особо важное, or especially important. Stalin personally ordered that all references to Tunguska research be removed from state archives. Kulik's earlier expedition notes were reclassified and stored under Meteor Studies Division. When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, fragments of these documents surfaced in the chaos of institutional collapse. One file contained photographs of a circular depression surrounded by charred forest. In the center, a team of men in radiation suits stood over a metallic sphere roughly 2 meters across. Written on the back of the photo were the words, "Recovered 1948, Site 4, unclassified mass 34 tons." Another file contained spectral analysis data showing isotope ratios inconsistent with any known meteorite. Russian geologists who examined the data concluded it was non-planetary in structure. The original samples, however, could not be located. A later memorandum, from the Russian Ministry of Atomic Energy in 1993 referenced unverified, pre-nuclear materials recovered during early testing, phase of Volkov operations. When queried by Western journalists, the ministry denied any knowledge of such programs. Yet satellite images taken that same year revealed restricted areas near the original Tunguska coordinates, guarded by military personnel and surrounded by newly erected radar domes. In 2002, a retired Soviet physicist named Ivan Petrov, who claimed to have been an assistant at Artemis 16, gave an interview to a German documentary crew. His words were calm but deliberate. It was not a meteor. It was a machine. The lattice wasn't shielding, it was containment. And it failed. Within a month, Petrov's apartment was ransacked. He died 3 weeks later of heart failure. The footage was never aired. The production company cited contractual issues. Today, the Tunguska zone remains one of the most restricted natural areas in Russia. Officially, the prohibitions are ecological. Yet hikers who have ventured near report strange electromagnetic interference that disables compasses and GPS equipment. The Russian Federal Decree No. 221, passed in 2001, classified all geological data relating to the area until 2070. More than a century after the explosion, the crater still yields occasional metal fragments, none more than a few centimeters long, all sharing the same strange honeycomb pattern described in the 1947 reports. Their isotopic ratios continue to defy identification. Scientists call it anomaly, archivists call it myth, but buried within the declassified whispers of Operation Volkov lies a possibility neither side of the Cold War dared confirm, that the blast which flattened Siberia in 1908 was not the end of an event, but the beginning of one, an ignition whose echo still hums beneath the frozen soil. Chapter 5. Shadow Fleet of the Baltic, Ghosts of Kiel. The Baltic Sea in 1956 was a place of uneasy silence. The war had ended more than a decade earlier, but the seabed still held its dead, rusted hulls, sunken convoys, and mines that could kill a trawler crew in seconds. For the Swedes patrolling those cold waters, it was a routine of listening and waiting. Yet on April 19th of that year, the sonar operator aboard the submarine HSWMS Sjöbjörnen recorded something that would shake Nordic naval intelligence for decades. At 02:47 hours, while conducting anti-submarine drills off the coast of Bornholm, the sonar picked up multiple submerged contacts moving in perfect formation. 3 elongated signatures spaced precisely 500 meters apart, maintaining a depth of 70 meters. The shapes were too deliberate to be wrecks, too steady to be marine life. Commander Lars Ekholm ordered a verification sweep. The contacts held course, silent and coordinated, heading northeast at 5 knots. They passed beneath the Swedish patrol and vanished into the darker thermocline layers of the Baltic. Within hours, the recordings were transferred to the Swedish Naval Command in Karlskrona. Acoustic analysts confirmed that the signatures did not match any known Soviet or NATO submarine design. Their hydrodynamic profiles corresponded to the Type WWII U-boats built by the Kriegsmarine during the final year of World War II, advanced models capable of extended underwater operation. But all Type WWII vessels had been accounted for or destroyed by 1946, all except 4, listed in German naval records as missing during Operation Nachtmeer. Declassified documents from the British Admiralty reveal that Operation Nachtmeer was a last-ditch evacuation effort launched from Kiel in April 1945, days before Germany's surrender. The mission's official purpose was to transport personnel and documents to neutral territory. However, post-war interrogations of captured U-boat crews hinted at something far more valuable: the transfer of special cargo under SS supervision, believed to be related to I.G. Farben's wartime chemical and propulsion research. None of the Nachtmeer submarines ever returned to port. In May 1956, after reviewing the Swedish sonar evidence, NATO established a temporary joint investigation under the codename Baltic Echo. British and American naval intelligence dispatched survey ships to the coordinates provided by Ekholm's crew. Over the course of 3 weeks, multiple sonar contacts were logged, yet each time divers attempted descent, visibility dropped to 0 and compass bearings reversed inexplicably. The divers reported an electromagnetic hum emanating through the water. When the expedition returned to port, the recorded magnetic tapes exhibited faint distortions, periodic pulses resembling encrypted Morse signals. By late June, the British Admiralty classified the findings and ordered the files transferred to Portsmouth under maritime technical anomalies. The official statement released to the press dismissed the incident as sonar malfunction caused by thermocline interference. But within the classified files, several photographs taken by a Swedish reconnaissance plane show a faint, elongated shadow beneath the surface, roughly 85 meters long, consistent with a type Hightithson's dimensions. In 1962, a Soviet fishing trawler operating near the same sector accidentally dredged a piece of metallic hull bearing the serial fragment U-38523. The number matched one of the submarines listed under Nachtmeer Command. Soviet authorities seized the artifact and quietly informed East German Naval Command. Internal KGB communications later revealed that radiation testing on the metal detected trace isotopes consistent with depleted uranium, a material never used in conventional submarine construction. Western intelligence grew increasingly concerned that the wrecks might contain remnants of Nazi nuclear or propulsion experiments. IG Farben's wartime files, seized in 1945, included references to Energizell B, an experimental energy storage system designed for naval applications. The technology was believed destroyed when the Allies bombed the Kiel shipyards. If fragments had survived aboard the lost submarines, their recovery could have major strategic implications in the Cold War's technological race. In 1968, British divers from the Special Boat Service conducted a covert dive near Fehmarn Belt, acting on a classified tip from a defected East German officer. They located an intact submarine hull resting upright on the seabed at a depth of 93 meters. The craft bore no identifying markings, but its construction matched German wartime engineering. Inside, the divers found the forward compartments flooded and the control room sealed by welded bulkheads. In the aft storage section, they discovered metal crates stenciled with IGF, Versuchsreihe, meaning experimental series. Each crate was sealed with lead solder. Within 48 hours, British Naval Command ordered all evidence confiscated. The divers' logs were redacted and the mission's existence denied. An internal Royal Navy memorandum dated August 14, 1968, now partially declassified, describes the recovered crates as containing industrial cylinders and reinforced containment vessels exhibiting unknown compound residue. The samples were flown to Portendown under night convoy for analysis. The results of that analysis remain classified. However, a separate report from 1970 confirms that the dive team was later recalled and subjected to medical observation for dermatological and neurological symptoms consistent with low-level radiological exposure. Throughout the 1970s, local fishermen near Kiel reported sonar anomalies and unexplained light emissions beneath the water at night. The German Federal Maritime Agency attributed them to chemical phosphorescence. Yet when oceanographers attempted to map the seafloor near the area, their instruments repeatedly failed. Naval historians from Hamburg University who requested access to the Nachtmeer files found that every record prior to May 1945 had been removed from the archives, replaced by a single page labelled Transferred to Allied Custody. In 1985, an aging engineer named Otto Reimers, who had worked at the Kiel shipyards during the war, gave an interview to a Danish radio station. He claimed that Nachtmeer was not evacuation, but burial. According to Reimers, 4 submarines were fitted with experimental cores intended to power long-range submersible weapons. They carried no bombs, he said. They carried hearts that could not stop beating. Within weeks of the broadcast, Reimers died in a traffic accident. The radio station received a government notice classifying the recording as of national security concern. When the Cold War ended, the mystery briefly surfaced again. In 1998, Danish divers searching for wrecks near the Langland Belt located a submarine hull entombed in silt. The shape matched a type WWII, but the exterior plating bore unfamiliar reinforcement ribs. Inside, they found no crew remains, only sealed compartments filled with metallic dust. Radiation sensors recorded faint but persistent readings. The team's footage was seized by authorities upon return to port, and the site was declared a hazardous contamination zone. Officially, it was designated UXO Disposal Area 12. Since then, naval historians and conspiracy researchers alike have tried to reconstruct what the Shadow Fleet really was. Some believe the submarines carried stolen Allied research. Others argue they were testbeds for nuclear propulsion long before the Americans launched their first atomic submarine. A declassified British telegram from 1957 may hold the key. It reads, "Recovered hulls consistent with U-boat design. Power source contained, unstable. Recommend continued suppression until verification of containment integrity." The Baltic remains quiet now, its surface betraying nothing of what sleeps beneath. But each year, Swedish sonar operators still report unexplained signals, slow rhythmic pulses too regular to be geological. They call them the heartbeats of Kiel. No one investigates anymore. The files are closed, the coordinates restricted, and the sea, indifferent and unmarked, continues to hold its secrets. The silent graves of machines that once belonged to men who refuse surrender, drifting endlessly through cold water, waiting for a war that never ended.